Today we will be walking along Laisvės or Liberty Avenue, which is the main pedestrian street in Kaunas, Lithuania. At 1.6 kilometers, or about a mile, it's the longest pedestrian street in Eastern Europe, and it's full of shops, cafes, restaurants, several theatres, museums, a school, and much more, as we will shortly find out. As we are arriving by car from our home in Birštenas, we firstly have to find somewhere to park, and it so happens that the largest shopping mall in the centre of Kaunas, so-called Acropolis, provides access to one end of Laisvės through a short connecting road. So that's where we'll park, and then we'll walk down through the shops out onto the street. On our way, we pass a building where no photographs are allowed, because the building is currently used as the head office of the Lithuanian Air Force, headquarters I should say. It's of interest to us because the building, which has no modern embellishments at all and some very original features, was used in the BBC filming of War and Peace. As we come to a pedestrian crossing and wait at the lights, we see on our left the shell of a building constructed in the Soviet Union and which will probably need to be knocked down, and on the top of it somebody's had the witty idea of displaying the longest known word in the Lithuanian language. I'll leave it to you to pronounce. As we approach the square with its impressive neo-Byzantine church, which is one end of Laisvės, we see on the left a pretty ugly block-like brutalist Soviet Union period building, which is Kaunas's principal art gallery. We now come into the square. We can see ahead of us on the left the entrance to the avenue. The square itself includes some restaurants, some commercial buildings, office buildings and so on, several large trees, a children's playground, as well as the aforementioned church. Next photo you will notice is of completely different quality because I've stolen it from the internet, given that I don't have a drone and the ability to give you an overall impression of what exactly the avenue looks like and how long it is. So now you've got some feel for where we're going to be walking. At the moment we're standing on the ground pretty well next to that large tree in front of the red building. Why this plaque is mounted in the ground at the very beginning of our walk is explained in the English text at the bottom, so I'll give you a minute or two to read that. Herr Zvotendik and his Japanese equivalent, Mr. Sugihara, between them worked almost continuously to exploit a loophole in the Nazi administration's rules and issue travel permits to as many Jewish people as they possibly could. Mr. Sugihara, in fact, disobeying the instructions of his own government. And by that means, thousands of Jewish people were able to exit Kaunas and, of course, thereby have their lives saved. To give you a feel of what the street is like, here's a picture looking back after about 1/4 of the walk has been completed, and you can see the large church with drapes over the building work restoring the facade. As an aside, Vero Cafe is probably the nearest thing to Starbucks or Costa in Lithuania, cafe chain, and not my favourite. I prefer going to smaller independents. There has always been some wall art in Kaunas, but as part of the preparations for Kaunas's role as European City of Culture in 2022, the amount of public art was significantly expanded, and this picture is especially moving. Seen on our left as we start our walk, it features two young Jewish people and some text written by a Jewish commentator, which we'll see in the next slide. So, as the arrow pointed at the bottom of the wall art, here is the text written by a Jewish commentator who himself survived the Holocaust, lived until 1994, and I've prepared a translation which will follow in the next picture. As we walk along a little further, we see on the left the Kaunas National Drama Theatre, which has recently been refurbished because Lithuania had two capitals during the 20th century. There are major theatres in both Vilnius and Kaunas, which gives plenty of opportunities for enjoying culture and the arts. As we walk along, we pass shops, restaurants and the like, and a selection of statues, but I'm not going to comment on every element of the walk because this presentation will get far too long. We now reach the halfway point and a major crossroads, which is marked by this modern fountain. As we walk past the fountain and look back, we see on the opposite side a large unoccupied building site. A lot of renovation and redevelopment has been going on in Kaunas, but after a rather ugly building was knocked down a couple of years ago, it appears there are no immediate plans to rebuild here, and some safety boards have been put up which are regularly refurbished with some sort of interesting presentation or celebration. Looking at one other arm of the crossroads at this point, you'll see restaurants, shops and so on, and that it's fully pedestrianised. You can see in the distance a metal oblong, which is in fact the approach to a bridge, across which on an island is the Kaunas Žalgiris basketball stadium. Žalgiris is the basketball equivalent of Manchester City for Lithuania, the top performing basketball team. Hopes to do well in the Euro League, hasn't done so this year, and the stadium is very useful for us because it's large enough to host pop concerts, theatre gigs, that sort of thing. We've been there quite a few times to see events. I was starting to get hungry at this stage, prompting me to start looking for a restaurant, and this one clearly not going to suit, with the main attraction being fish courses. You might be interested in some of the language. It's obvious what sushi means. You can see the word avocado and solotas in there. Prosecco doesn't need translation. And of course, local beer is local beer. Here's a statue worth commenting on. Attractive presentation of a man called Donskis, who was a famous Jewish singer, travelled widely in both Western and Eastern Europe, as well as to Russia before the Second World War, popularising Schlagers, music songs, not a style I like, reminds me of German Umpa bands, and his songs were resurrected really and redone by a modern Lithuanian singer who prompted the authorities to install this statue. Here I took a photo looking back to where we started. That's the dome of the currently under restoration former Orthodox, now Catholic Soborus church in the square where our walk commenced, and of course we just come past the fountain. You can see we're in the middle where there are a lot of seats and flower beds following the recent resurfacing of the whole avenue. Either side are two further very wide lanes, one of which is dedicated more or less to cyclists, with two lanes going in each direction. No doubt that acquired an EU grant, and you can see the scope for children, families, old people. It's a very sociable place. In the little courtyard off the avenue is this small cinema built in Art Deco style, as indeed much of the Kaunas new town was in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Rita remembers this from Soviet Union days. It has, I believe, been restored. I've not been there, something we must put on our to-do list. Pausing again at a small square with an opening into a small park, nicely wooded with mature trees and water features, we see in the background the second of the theatres on our walk. This is the Muzikinis Teatras. I don't think I need to translate that for you. Once again, a particularly attractive building. In fact, the building looked so nice in the sunshine, set in the small park, that I went out of my way to take a second picture to give you a better impression. The huge amount of building work that went on in Kaunas in the 1930s allowed architects of all sorts to have a go, and apart from numerous Art Deco buildings, there are others are very specific styles, one even named after the Amsterdam School of Architecture. Here is the original 1930s town hall, which I think would be classified as modernist, and there's a fair amount of that type of building style around New Kaunas. To one side of the town hall is the old post office, which has an absolutely magnificent interior, but is unfortunately closed at the moment after a temporary use during the 2022 year of culture events. I don't think anybody has yet come up with the money to do a full restoration, but it will be a brilliant example of an Art Deco building well worthy of being featured in an episode of Hercule Poirot when it eventually gets done. This is another view from the same spot, and I think the sort of scene you would see in any European city that was substantially bombed during the Second World War, and probably we'll see in the future in Ukraine, sadly. Here you've got a mixture of some original architecture, no doubt much restored. Red brick is unusual, typically German influenced. Then some older classical or mock classical building work, and behind it, well, 20th century glass. Between the town hall and the post office is quite a substantial building labelled Vaistine, which is Lithuanian for pharmacy, and it's been a pharmacy right back into the Soviet Union times, as far as Rita can remember. At one end, there now operates a rather sweet vegan restaurant, which is exactly where we had our lunch. We actually sat at that table where the little girl and probably her granny are sitting at the moment. The pharmacy still operates with some pretty original fittings, so it's very interesting, and superb collection of houseplants. It's actually a natural medicines and homeopathic treatments operation these days, perhaps rather fitting for the vegan restaurant. Opposite where we had lunch and in front of the musical theatre, there is set in a long strip of stone the name Romas Kalanta. Kalanta was a 19-year-old student who, on the 14th of May 1972, tipped 3 litres of petrol on himself and set it on fire. He picked the location because it was where the puppet Lithuanian government declared that Lithuania would become a Soviet Socialist Republic in 1940. Of course, the KGB confiscated the note he left, but they did preserve it in typical Russian bureaucratic efficiency. It was released in 1990 when the KGB archives were opened, and the note read, "Blame only the regime for my death." It's time for us to get going again and walk off our lunch. So here's a quick look at what's ahead of us. This is the left-hand side as we continue. This is another building that's both interesting in terms of its architecture. You can see Art Deco features in the column above the entrance door, and also its function. Claire probably knows from her Russian that Knigos means books. This was the Kaunas Central bookstore. It still operates as a bookstore, though it's now in modern style, somewhat more like a Waterstones, and naturally includes a cafe. One thing that's different about Lithuanian large cities, in my experience, is that the main street, which almost always intersects with or includes a large town square for public functions, includes amongst its buildings all sorts of things like churches, museums, theatres, and not just commercial shops. And here we pass the Kaunas Zoological Museum, named after a man called Tadas Ivanauskas, who did all sorts of work in establishing natural history research in Lithuania. Behind these doors is a recently restored, again, significant museum, not quite up to London standards, but interesting and worth a visit nonetheless. To validate my comments about the unusual range of buildings you'll find in a high street in a big Lithuanian city, we have here the main entrance to one of the Kaunas gymnasia, or gymnasium schools. Gymnasium not in the sports sense, but in the Western European sense, meaning a school with a select curriculum, probably comparable with an English grammar school, but not exactly so. I always think I would have liked to go to school here. We could go out in your break and be right in the middle of the city. This building and courtyard you simply would not find unless you had a very good tourist guide. You have to access it through a small alleyway, no signposts, as is often the case in Lithuania. The church has clearly been significantly repaired and restored, but the chestnut tree adjacent has survived many years and a period of no doubt complete contempt for religious buildings during the Soviet Union. The church looks absolutely out of place, hemmed in by all the modern construction, but nonetheless is an absolute gem in its own right, in my opinion. Mounted on a wall in the church courtyard is this iron cross, which, when discovered in the 1990s, was probably already 450 years old. Now, for something made of metal, that's truly remarkable. In fact, construction of crosses in both wood and iron are folk arts in Lithuania, so this item is of particular interest. There is a sign in English, Lithuanian, Italian, German and Polish, should you want to read one of those languages. This is the entrance to the church with a rather attractive door. I have to admit this photograph was a little bit self-indulgent in that I've got some new photographic gear and I wanted to see if I could get the exposure right so that the outside was correctly exposed. You could see inside the church and the window in the back wasn't burned out, and I think I got a good result. Coming out through the alleyway from the church courtyard, we find ourselves pretty well at the top end of Laisvės, and we can look back towards the square where we started. As a curious aside, there is a building on the left with a restaurant on the ground floor, and what's behind the darker windows upstairs is in fact a strip club. Now, Eastern European cities probably had slightly seedy reputations because of the relatively large numbers of such establishments that you found when walking about. I certainly noticed it in Prague, for example. When I first came to Kaunas, the Jehovah's Witnesses temporary Kingdom Hall was in fact adjacent to a strip club. Neither are now in that location nowadays. So this sort of business activity is now discreet as it is in other Western European cities, and that element of disreputableness has, I think, largely disappeared.